Welcome to In the Black, the podcast that shines a light on resilience, transformation, and the power of reinvention. I'm Araceli, and each week, my co host Shannon and I sit down with incredible women who face some of life's hardest challenges, from personal setbacks to societal obstacles, and have emerged on the other side stronger, driven, and ready to make a difference.
On In the Black, we celebrate these stories of strength and success, diving deep into the journeys of women who turned pain into purpose, adversity into action, and now dedicate themselves to making the world a better place in their own way. They're here to inspire, share hard-earned wisdom, and remind us all, no matter how dark things may seem, life is cyclical, and dawn is coming. So, whether you're looking for inspiration, motivation, or just a reminder that change is always possible, this is the podcast for you. Welcome to In the Black.
Today, we're thrilled to welcome Anne Marie Wells, an award winning poet, playwright, and memoirist. Anne Marie is the author of Survived by, a memoir in verse and other poems, and the winner of the Cinnamon Press 2023 Chapbook Contest for her work Mother, Verb. As a passionate advocate for the healing power of creative expression, she has facilitated her therapeutic writing workshop, Synonyms for Grief, both across the United States and virtually, helping individuals navigate their grief journeys through writing. Join us as we dive into her profound work and insightful approach to healing. So, our first question is just introduce yourself. Kind of give us just a little bit about you, what you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, I'm a poet and writer and memoirist. And 5 years ago now, I lost my dad to stage 4 lung cancer. His the time between his diagnosis and his burial was only about 4 months. And during that time, I was his full-time caregiver. I uprooted my life in Wyoming, where I was living at the time, traveled cross country with my dog to care for him in Florida. I know that you're in Florida too. And at the time, I was a writer, but definitely not a poet. I was more working on rom-com stage plays. So that was more of my genre. And during this time, I was having anticipatory grief of knowing that his life was coming to an end. And I had all of these well-meaning friends and acquaintances reaching out to me, but I really didn't have the emotional, mental, spiritual capacity to engage with them and to respond. So I started blogging about my experience, watching my dad, my hero, um, slowly, slowly shrink, slowly lose the vivaciousness that he had, and ultimately die. I was the one with him in the room when he passed. And I wrote these blogs kind of as a catharsis, as a way to process what I was experiencing, but also to streamline sharing the information so that I didn't have to repeat everything to every single person who asked. It was like, if you care, friend, enemy, lurker, you have access to this information. And maybe it would be helpful to somebody else who's also struggling if they have a loved one who is struggling with a cancer diagnosis or a terminal illness. Then maybe they would have some sort of um, reprieve or solace reading about somebody else's struggle that is similar to theirs. And before my dad passed away, on one of our worst days, he wasn't able to get up. He was so weak from chemo and just so sick. Um, my mom and I decided to call the ambulance, and he was rushed to the hospital. It turned out that he had sepsis and pneumonia on top of his stage 4 lung cancer. And as I lay on this little sofa next to his hospital gurney, him sleeping with all of the wires and tubes hooked up to him. They were prepping him for a blood transfusion, and I thought for sure this was going to be his last day on earth. I mean, healthy people die of sepsis, let alone people who have stage 4 lung cancer. So I didn't think that there was a chance for him. And I was compelled to write a poem, even though I had never written poetry before then. I would never have said I was a poet. It wasn't a genre that I practiced. It wasn't even something that interested me. I didn't really read poetry. Um, I was more interested in slam poets, like on the stage versus on the page. I hadn't uh, I hadn't taken courses or workshops or anything like that in poetry, but something compelled me to write a poem. And I didn't have a notebook or anything. I didn't have a pen. I had a receipt in my bag, and then I borrowed a pen from the nurse's station in order to write a poem. And I wrote a poem about um, going to the beach with my dad. Whenever I would visit in Florida, we would always go to the beach and go for a walk on the beach. And one time when we were walking, we suddenly saw a baby turtle just flopping around in the sand, heading to the ocean. And then we saw another one. And then we saw another one and another one and another one. And we were following this line of baby turtles all the way to its sandy nest. And we stayed there until the sun, even after the sun went down, we were just watching all of these turtles come out of the sand and just kind of emerging kind of out of nowhere and then flopping their little tiny bodies to the ocean and being swept away. And this was like before smartphones, so we didn't have a flashlight to navigate back. We only had the light of the screen of my Motorola Razr cell phone, and we navigated back to our car using that little light because we couldn't stop watching. We couldn't stop watching this miracle happen. And so as my dad was so sick next to me in the hospital bed, I wrote a poem about that. And then I couldn't stop writing poems. Shortly after that, maybe it was like a month after that, he was recommended to hospice. But by then I had already been writing poems almost every day. And when I was living in hospice with him, I had my laptop in my lap. I was writing poems all day, every day for the 2 weeks that he was in hospice before he passed. And because I had some knowledge of the writing world, though playwriting is very different than writing poetry, but because I had other writer friends, I went to writers' conferences, that kind of thing. I knew about submitting your work for publication, sending your work out to literary journals. I knew that it had existed. I had never done it before, but because um, I was caring for him full time, I had resigned from my job. I at first was working remotely and then working half time and then even working quarter time. They were giving me a lot of allowances, and then I finally resigned because I just didn't have it in me to care about budgets or presentations or customers or anything. And I started submitting my poems to literary magazines. And lo and behold, my turtle poem got accepted for publication. I was so shocked that anybody would read my book and or read my work and think, "Oh yeah, I want to publish this. I want to put that in my literary magazine." And so before my dad passed away, I was able to tell him about 5 different poems that were accepted for publication in literary journals, which was just so special. I had no idea at the time that it was going to erupt into my full-fledged career like it has. And so after he passed away, I did return to Wyoming, and I had resigned from my job. I took on a an entry-level caregiving job. I was caregiving for adults with disabilities. That was very healing for me, but it also allowed me flexibility to go back to school And this was in the early part of 2020. So now we're entering lockdown with the pandemic, and suddenly university classes were all online. And I was and workshops, writers workshops that were taking place in Seattle or Boston or Georgia or Austin or Los Angeles, now we're all online. And it allowed me in my rural area in Wyoming to submerge myself in poetry, to use that poetry as a blanket, a salve, uh, healing elixir as I was going through grief. My whole world became about creative writing and writing poetry. And in writing my book, Survive By, I utilized those blog posts that I had written about my grief journey as the foundation for my memoir in verse. It really allowed me to go back and remember all of these little details that um, when you're in acute grief, your brain just kind of stops working and you forget so many details. It's like a defense mechanism that you just kind of block it out. But because I had blogged about it, I had all of these details, and it helped me to remember even more. And and so then, as a result of this book and writing these poems and having this cathartic experience, I then decided I needed to help others do the same thing, even if they had never written before. Because it wasn't like I had been writing poetry for 10 years or my whole life. You hear stories from people like, I've been writing poetry since high school, or like since elementary school, or since I knew how to write, I've been writing poetry. But that wasn't my story. I've only been writing poetry for about 5 years. And it kind of feels like if I can do it, you can do it. And so I developed this poetry workshop that's based on a poem by K.E. Ogden called Synonyms for Grief, about losing her father, in fact. And um, I created a creative writing workshop that invites people, writers and non-writers alike, to use writing prompts and inspirations from other people's poetry to then write their own story, to write their own homages to their loved ones that they lost, or to just get down on paper what they've been holding in on the inside, so that it can just be like a first step in the process of I don't know, healing maybe, or um not, I don't want to say letting go, because that feels like so finite. You never let it go. Um, but I guess just not holding it in anymore. So yeah, that's I guess a big long about rambling way uh to share from point A to point B.
I love that. So it sounds like your dad and you were really, really close, which is beautiful and in my world a little rare. I feel like there's always grief and, a part of you that always has some sort of feeling of your parents passing. But how long do you think did you grieve for while you were going through this whole journey of, writing poems? And at some point, did you feel a shift in how you were feeling and a difference in channeling what you were feeling?
I don't know if there was this distinct moment. I I was very close with my dad. I'm very close with my mom as well. I call her on the phone every day. Um, we talk every day. And my dad was just a very loving, caring human being. It's hard to not be close with him because he's just so wonderful. Everybody loved him. He was a very kind and generous person. Um, I still weep. I still weep for him. It was the anniversary of his death, he died 5 days before his birthday, so his death anniversary and his birthday are around the same time. February in general is a really hard month for me, and I still weep for him, and especially now, because I'm a new mom and my son is 10 months old now. There are all of my son's firsts that I get to share with my mom, but I don't get to share with my dad. Or even just sharing the news with my mom that she was going to be a grandma, that I don't get to share that news with my dad, at least in the same way. Um, I did have an experience when I was pregnant. I went to his grave. Anytime I visit my mom, I always visit my dad too. And I was just scream crying in the cemetery. I'm getting choked up thinking about it now, but I was screaming at the in the cemetery like, "I wish you knew," or "I wish I knew that you knew. I wish that I knew that you knew." And I screamed that so loud into the air, and right when I screamed that, this loud train whistle went off. Like, the train was, like, right next to me, and it was just like, "Choo! Choo!" And it was like he was telling me, "I do know. Like, I do know." And I just started laughing. I just started laughing that, you know, maybe, some people would say it's just a coincidence, but I mean, it was such a coincidence. So, yeah, I don't feel like there's this moment where, like, suddenly you cross a line into, healed. In my book, I talk about it as, like, a finish line that says "healed" across the top, that there's no, like, running across the finish line, and now you're healed, and here's your participatory medal and your ticket for a free beer at the beer tent, there's no, distinguishable, at least for me in my journey, there hasn't been this distinguishable, moment of relief. I think it was incremental over time, and definitely writing poems about my dad and my love for him and my grief for him, and I still write poems about him, especially when I have a dream with him in it, or a dream in which even in my dream he's dead, which are, two different experiences. I'll write a poem about it. But when right after he passed, I definitely was much more of a mess than I am today. If anybody mentioned their dad or mentioned my dad, or um I mean, it would just set me off, and I would just weep. I would and it was unpredictable that I would be going through my day, I would be brushing my teeth, and then suddenly I was on the floor sobbing and crying myself to sleep, waking up crying. Um, and I remember when I was in that very acute grief stage, one of my very good friends, Lauren, she had lost her dad to pancreatic cancer. His journey was much longer than my dad's. Um, Her dad lived for 7 years with pancreatic cancer, battling it before he passed, and spent the days before he passed in a coma, whereas with my dad, it really felt like one day he was here and one day he wasn't, and, just different experiences, but she told me, and her dad passed away in 2013. So, my dad passed away in 2020. At that point, it had been 7 years since her dad passed away, and she told me, "There will come a day when you think about that absolutely insane thing that your dad used to do that drove you crazy, or you would think about that funny thing that he said, and you will laugh instead of cry." And I couldn't imagine that world. What did that world feel like? I had no idea, because I couldn't think about my dad, good or bad, without falling apart. And now I am in a place where I can think of the totally insane things that he would do, or um with my son Orion, I can picture him when we went to visit my mom or when she comes up here to visit. Um, I can picture like when Orion is fussing, my son, when he's like fussing, I can imagine my dad saying, what?" Like in this like gentle voice. This is how like that was how he talked to the pets when they were complaining. If they were complaining about something and he would just say, What?" Like back to them. And I could picture that in my head and smile and know, um, like he's still very much alive. He's still very much alive. And definitely writing has helped me get to that place. I think also knowing that my writing has helped other people. When I read reviews of my book from people I don't even know, strangers who have found my book or were recommended to read my book, and they write, "This book has helped me so much," or "This book put into words what I couldn't say myself." That is healing in itself as well, um, knowing that my pain, my struggle, my path has meaning to it. That the meaning is to help other people on their path, on their grief journey, in their struggle, in their pain. That has also been helpful. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. I love hearing those stories, especially the stories of um, maybe it was a coincidence, but truly, you always think, I know it's him or, this angel or something that happened. Have you experienced, oh, this is just for me because I'm curious. Have you experienced any other times where you knew that he was near or that you knew that his energy was alive and or with you, guiding you?
Yes, a couple come to mind right away. The first time so I left Florida, I went back to Wyoming, and the first time that I went back to Florida to visit my mom, she picked me up from the airport and drove me back to her apartment, and we parked and it was night. It was dark out. And when we stepped out of the car, this giant meteor flew across the sky. Not a shooting star, like not just a little tiny thing. It was a ball that was like neon green and then went to yellow and then orange before disappearing in the sky. It was enormous. I had never seen any kind of nighttime phenomenon like that in my life. And both my mom and I stopped in our tracks. Like, did you see that? And I just felt like, because I had been thinking and feeling in my heart that it just felt so sad that I was coming to see my mom and that my dad wasn't going to be there, and it was like he was saying, "I am here, like, I'm here too." Um, there also have been the times that he has appeared to me in my dreams. Um, yeah, just wonderful. I love when he visits. Sorry, I do miss him terribly because he's so wonderful. The first time
Sorry,
Go ahead.
need to make you cry. I'm so sorry.
No, it's a good cry, though. It's bittersweet, you know? It means that there's a lot of love there. Um, so before he passed, I told him, like, if it's possible, please haunt me. Like, please haunt me if it's possible. If there's anything that you can do to send me a sign, please send me signs. And he said he would. And for about 3 months after he passed, I begged him to send me a sign. I begged him. And then I had a dream that I traveled to the moon. And when I got out onto the moon, my dad was there. And he wasn't sick. He wasn't pale. He wasn't gaunt. It was like the dad that I knew, full bodied, healthy. And we were bounding weightless on the moon in bare feet. And I remember thinking, oh, my feet are bare. Am I going to be cold? But we just were jumping and leaping all over the moon in, how you imagine astronauts would be on the moon. And we were laughing, looking at our bare feet that were just covered in gray moon dust. And when I woke up to the sound of my own laughter. And it was like, um, I felt like I had met him halfway. Like I had asked him to haunt me or send me signs, but it was like I met him halfway. Um, Another sign I got from him, um, I told you after I came back from Wyoming because I had resigned from my job and had taken on a caregiving job. And on New Year's Eve, I was working on New Year's Eve, and there was a fireworks show that was happening um, close to the home of the four women that I was helping to caregive for. And um, they weren't able to go to the fireworks show, but they had this big window um, facing that direction. And so I flipped the couch around so that they could all sit on the couch looking out the window to watch the fireworks. And I put on like country radio because they love country music. And I was feeling very sad. It was, the 2020 to 2021, transition, or maybe the fireworks were still happening, but they weren't, allowing people to go watch it because of the pandemic. I can't really remember, but for whatever reason, I was in their home with them. And as soon I was feeling very sad because I was feeling like I don't wanna live in another year that my dad doesn't get to experience. I don't wanna live in this future that he never gets to see. And right when the fireworks started, like, right on cue, Willie Nelson's "On the Road Again" came on, which was my dad's song. Like, anytime that we went to the airport, when he would drop me back at the airport to go back home after visiting, or when I was, in college and he would drive me back to school after a break or something like that, he had his Willie Nelson CD, and he would put it in, and we would listen to "On the Road Again," and when we buried him to "On the Road Again," by Willie Nelson, and right as the fireworks started, like, they shot up into the sky and exploded right when that song came on, and I just started crying my eyes out. I just felt like he was telling me that I am here with you, like, it's okay. Um, so yeah, there have definitely been signs, coincidences, but it just feels like too good to be true. And I would say before my dad passed away that I would have considered myself an atheist. And now I have to say, I don't know. I have to believe that there's more out there than we're able to understand because these coincidences just seem too good to be true. And I want them to be true as well. I want to believe that my dad is still around somehow, knowing these things somehow. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I even got teary-eyed, so I love stories like that. What was the first step you took to becoming an award-winning poet, playwright, and memoirist? And did you face any challenges in making that transition?
Yeah, so I do talk about this a lot with my current students. And I think one of my both assets and struggles is that I don't have an MFA. I didn't um, climb the ranks, if you will, through academia, which allows me the freedom to experiment. I didn't have a lot of background and exposure to the, quote unquote elite poets that everybody worships, like Robert Frost and Walt Whitman and T.S. Eliot and all of those um, poets of the past that everybody just bows down to. And because I didn't have that exposure, I also wasn't told from these authorities what poetry should be or what poetry should sound like. And I think that that is an asset for me because I don't have also self-consciousness of, oh, this isn't good enough, or this isn't like these other award-winning poets, so people aren't going to like this. I really have this mentality of, well, this is my style, and this is my style of poetry, and people are going to like it or they're not, and lots of people don't. Although lots of people don't. Um, but I compare it to music. When you go to music school, and I have never been to music school, so I don't know if this is true. This is just me supposing. You study Mozart, you study Chopin, you study Beethoven, you studied these great musicians, and the people who listen to these great musicians are not going to be the same people who listen to Britney Spears and love it. But those people still exist. There are still people who listen to Britney Spears and love it. They're completely different genres of music, and they're for completely different audiences. And so I feel like poetry is the exact same way, that there are people who love the classics, who love all of those, you know, ancestral poets, maybe you can say. And then there are the people who love modern poetry and more of the experimentation realm. And there are going to be people who love rhyming poetry and people who hate rhyming poetry. There are going to be people who love poems about, walking bare feet in the grass and listening to the birds singing. And there's going to be a person out there who says that is my worst nightmare. So being true to myself and not writing poetry in a way that I think I should be writing or somebody told me is the way to write poetry, I think has helped me a lot to stand out from the crowd. When I submit my work, it does look different probably than a lot of the other entries that contests or literary magazines receive. And I think because of that, I have both lost opportunities, but then also have gained opportunities as well. I think just being true to myself and what I want to do has helped me.
While you were going through submitting the work that you were doing, can you take us through any moments in your life that you faced a significant challenge while doing that?
Yeah, definitely. I faced challenges, particularly when I was trying to find a home for my book. I wrote the collection Survive By in 2020 to 2021. I mean, it was all of my poems about my dad, but it was also about my relationship at the time. Um, uh, to add even more drama, I was engaged to be married. My partner at the time and I were trying to have a wedding before my dad passed away. He ended up passing away 2 weeks before our wedding, and I just canceled everything. I was so bereft that it wasn't possible to have a wedding. Um, which ended up being a positive thing because he and I are no longer together. And so I also wrote about the struggles I was experiencing in my relationship. I was grieving, but then that psychological, emotional, spiritual burden was weighing on my relationship as well. And then it was in pandemic mode, so then there's, like, the weight of the world and the fear in the world. Also, it was just a lot of pressure. It was a lot of pressure, so I wrote about that as well. So then my first iteration of my book was kind of going back and forth between my father slowly succumbing to his illness, but then also my relationship slowly ending as well. And I pitched the book to a lot of different indie publishers. Literary agents and that kind of thing is not really the realm of poetry, especially when you're starting out. Most poets go through these smaller publishers to get published. And so I was pitching my book to different publishers, and it was just no after no after no. Like, thank you so much for submitting your work. And a lot of form rejections, just dear writer, thank you so much for considering us for your work. And not even personalized or anything like that, just a blanket rejection, which felt hard because I had this greater why. I had this deeper meaning to my book. It wasn't just, oh, I want my book to be published. It was like, I want to honor my father in this way. And also, I want to help others in their grieving journey. And also, this is for my family as well. And I got very close. I had one publisher meet with me. We had like an hour and a half conversation where the two people running it were just gushing about my poetry and telling me how great it was. And they were like, wow, this poem and this poem. And then um, it was me just waiting to hear back from them, and then 2 months later, after I kind of was like, "Hey, so how about my book?" They were like, "Oh, yeah, we decided to pass." Like that. Um, but because of that experience, I did reevaluate my book and say, "Okay, what do I want this book to be about? I want it to be about my dad. Okay, I'm going to then condense the focus. And instead of writing also about my relationship at the time, I took out all of that stuff. I mean, it's still mentioned, but not in the way that it originally was. I feel like it was a little bit muddled about, like, oh, okay, what is this poem about again? Like, is she talking about like her relationship, or is that her relationship with her dad? It was like getting confused. And so I rewrote it, and I took those blog posts that I had told you about. I used those as the foundation for my work. And the book that I have published is very different from the book that I had originally tried to get published. And even though that was such a struggle, and I mean, a 2-year struggle, it wasn't until 2023 when my book, or well, 2022 when it was accepted for publication, but then 2023 when it was actually published. So 2 to 3 years after I wrote those poems and those blog posts. Even though that was a struggle, I'm also glad that the first version of my book didn't get published, because this newer iteration is so much better, and I feel like it it honors my dad in the way that I really want it to. And it's all about him and our relationship and my grieving journey for him. And maybe in another time I'll write about that relationship and that grieving journey of that relationship ending, but it wasn't the time or place to talk about that too. It was like just focusing on the one thing I think helped it. And then I still sent it out to places, and they still told me no even after I had revised it and turned it into something new. But then I did get that yes. and that was the yes from the publisher who published it, Curious Corvid Publishing, and I'm so proud of this book. It's something that I feel good about telling others to read. And I'm so glad that they're not reading my like, "Oh, I'm so sad that my relationship is ending" poems. I'm so glad that those aren't in the world in the iterations that they were in the first book. So, it was meant to be, even though in the moment it hurt.
When you took it back, was it the same publisher that you took before? Like, was it one of the same ones that you had taken it before and then they had accepted it? A different
No,
publisher?
so it was brand new, yeah. And I was also watching my friends get their books published. I was watching friend after friend get their poetry collections published. And so then I felt like the ugly duckling, like I felt like, well, what's wrong with my collection that it's not getting picked up? Um, but then it did eventually find a home and a good one. And my publisher was wonderful to work with and getting the cover and the layout design just right. And I had a really beautiful launch party. It was all virtual because I have poetry friends from all over the country and the world, um, who came uh, to the Zoom event. And yeah, just wonderful support that I've gotten. And yeah, it was meant to be in this case.
So, the name of our podcast is In the Black, and it is talking about being in a positive place in your world. So, for you personally, what does being in the black mean to you?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, we were kind of talking about earlier, when you're in this acute grieving process, that there's no direct finish line of like, oh, now I'm healed. But I think that, like I had, I told this story about my friend had lost her dad to cancer 7 years before my dad did. And when I was in this like horrible grieving um state and not functioning as a human being, she told me that there would come a day that I would think about those funny things that my dad would do or say, and I would laugh instead of cry. And I think that being in that place now where I can think about my dad and not just completely dissolve into crumble into pieces, I think that means being in the black, for me. And in addition, I think also being in this place where I can facilitate creative writing workshops specifically for the grieving and helping others to navigate their own grief journeys, that I feel strong enough and I have the desire also to help others. I'm I think that that shows that I'm in a healthier, more positive place in my heart, in my spirit, in my mind. And definitely don't think I would have been capable of doing so 5 years ago, right after my dad passed away. But I think also through this process that helped me get into the black and stay there. And of course I still grieve, as of course I still have moments of weeping and sadness and missing him and wishing it didn't happen, of course. And at the same time, I can laugh and I can even tell jokes and I can smile and I can um, play with my new baby and he can make a smile or like have a little look in his eye that looks a little bit like my dad. And I can feel warm inside and feel good about that instead of sad.
If you could give our listeners one piece of advice to help them going through a similar struggle, going through a similar experience, what would you give them?
Yeah, I think what I wish somebody had told me was to just get rid of the shoulds. Like what you should be doing, what you should be capable of, what you should be feeling. just eliminate that word from your lexicon completely. Um, one thing that I felt a lot was I shouldn't be feeling this sad still, or I shouldn't fall to pieces when somebody mentions their dad, or I should be grateful for all that I do have, or I should be able to, get dressed in the morning and brush my hair. I should be, blah, 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 on and on and on of all of these expectations that either others put on us or we put on ourselves. And it's just not helpful. It's not healthy. And I wish somebody had told me to just eliminate that from my word or from my world and to just accept whatever I was going through in the moment and just say, you know what? Today I am struggling brushing my hair and getting dressed. And just say that is where I am today. And there's no you should be able to do it or you should be in some other place. And I think just embracing all of the wide range of emotions and um, the different ways that people grieve is much healthier and um, better for the psyche and the heart as well.
How do you envision your work and impact growing in the future? And also, where can our listeners find you?
Yeah. When I wrote that first poem when my dad was sick, I had no idea that it would turn into this. And it's my entire life now. I host a weekly Zoom show, The Joy of Poeting, where I demonstrate different poetic forms to people who are interested, and it's free to join. And I think where I see it growing in the future is having this joy of poeting being more of my brand. I am in the process of writing a craft book. We were talking earlier about how I didn't go through academia to learn how to write or to write poetry, so I didn't have this like what a poem should be ingrained into my head, which I think is a good thing. And so I want to write my own craft book that is completely outside of the realm of academia of what a poem should be or shouldn't be, or what consists of a good poem versus a not good poem, and have it be more like for amateurs by an amateur, and have that be called the joy of poeting, like writing for the joy of it rather than trying to show like how great you are or how smart you are or whatever. So I'm hoping that that is how my world expands, that I lean into this, the joy of poeting, that you can find joy from writing poetry and anybody can do it, whether you think you're good at it or not. They can find me online. I have my website, Anne Marie Wells Writer, Writer, not writer like a motorcycle. And I'm on Anne Marie Wells Writer on like all the platforms. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok. I put all of my Joy of Poeting episodes up on my YouTube at the same name. And then I also have a writerly newsletter that goes out every month where I have a writing prompt and submission opportunities where I submitted my work to so that others can too, and upcoming events and other kind of writer news that I put out there into the world. So I'm around. If anybody wants to find me, you can also type Google the joy of poeting, and I'm probably the only person out there doing that. So
Thank you so much for coming on our podcast and applying. It's been a joy listening to your heartfelt stories, and thank you so much for sharing it with the world. And hopefully, it'll help the listener or two um, change their perspective.
Thank you again.
Thank you
yeah,
so
thank you both.
much.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of In the Black. I hope today's story left you feeling inspired and reminded of the incredible strength that lies in each of us. Our guest today has taken her toughest challenges and transformed them into something beautiful, reminding us all that even in the darkest moments, there's always a way to find light in the world.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, make sure to subscribe and share In the Black with another woman who could use a little encouragement. Together, we're building a community of passion, purpose, and power. Until next time, stay strong, stay inspired, and remember your story matters. Your choices change things, and being your most authentic self can and will change the world around you.